Hello, this is David Brower, the Sensorial Guide Pleasure Coach. I welcome you today. We're going to be having a conversation about permission for pleasure today with a special guest, Harriet Waley-Cohen, who will be joining here any second as I bring her onto this Facebook Live. So welcome, and as you join, let us know where you are listening from. Where are you listening from? Love to hear from you as we get things started up here. Today's conversation will be looking at the question of why do we need permission for pleasure? And my special guest, once I bring her on here, welcome Sandy. It's nice to see you. Essex, UK, that's great. Once we get our guest here, Essex, UK. Nice. Well, I am in France on the Atlantic coastline here. The weather is finally really beautiful this afternoon, and nonetheless I wanted to spend this time with you to talk about permission for pleasure. And I'm bringing a special guest on here for you. Once I can get her on the screen here. Hi Gaia, where are you watching from, Gaia? Love to hear. Okay, there's Harriet. See if we can bring her on board here. Any minute now, she'll be with us. So happy you're here, Harriet. There we go. I'm going to bring you on camera here. Ladies and gentlemen, Harriet Waley-Cohen. Here she goes.
Okay, better. It's all better. There's no
there
echo.
She is. Welcome, Harriet.
There's no echo. I'm praying for no echo.
Hey,
There's no
Poppy,
echo.
welcome.
We're all good.
Is that
How
better
you doing?
for you? Is that better
It's
for you,
much
Harriet?
better. I'm just going to find you on my laptop so that I can reshare this
How is
on my group.
Yeah, tell me, Poppy, Gaia, and the others, how is the sound for you? There's no echo. Oh, thank you. That's beautiful. We had a little bit of echo before, but now it's gone, which is good. Today we are going to be speaking with Harriet Waley-Cohen, my very lovely guest, about permission for pleasure. And I guess the kind of the first question that I just want to bring up is, like, why do we need permission for pleasure?
I agree. Why? But I think that this is very connected with where people get their self-worth from. And if people get their self-worth from being productive, from creating profit, from getting stuff done, from helping others, there's not a lot of space for pleasure in that, unless you get pleasure from doing all of that. But actually, I think there's a lot of brainwashing that goes on in this capitalist world, and in and especially for the women that I work with, who often have allowed anacritic and secret self-doubt and this kind of thing, where they're so busy trying to win validation from others that they feel they have to achieve and overgive, and it's just making space for pleasure's sake. It's just not it. It never even occurred to them that it could be on a list, or that it was even a thing. It's just not in their time for not in their mindset of available things that they could choose for themselves to prioritize. So I think that's why it's about saying, hey, this is a thing you're allowed to have for no reason other than it's amazing. And I think it goes both ways. When you have to have that self-worth to allow it, but also allowing it to yourself brings the self-worth too. It's a feedback loop, a very beautiful feedback loop. But that's from from my tribe, I guess, the women that I work with, that's where I would see it. They're often, it's one of the first things that I ask them to do is to take themselves on dates, go and do stuff for the sheer joy of it. And they're like, what? Like just for an hour, and even trying to get them to spend 1 hour once a week, just doing something for the sheer joy and pleasure of it is like, they don't know what to do. I'm like, let's brainstorm a list of things to do. And they're like, I don't know. I have no idea.
So what if pleasure could be made more purposeful, let's say, or potentially that you get a sense of significance as you are experiencing the pleasure? Would that potentially give a new spin or a different perspective that could make it more valuable and meaningful?
I mean, you're the pleasure guy, right? Pleasure's your thing. What do you think the purpose of pleasure is?
Well, I aspire to live my life in a way where pleasure is actually purposeful, and pleasure is the way that I gain the most expansion and growth and connection. And it's how I go to my edges and how I dare, and where I allow myself to feel more than think. Yes,
it's about being, isn't it? It's not about doing.
Yeah, and
it's
also
about being.
Yeah, it's a lot about
and it's
being.
very embodied, isn't it? Pleasure requires a real connection with your physicality.
It requires a presence for sure. If you want to really get the most out of it, your presence makes an experience way more enriching. Whether it's making love, eating food, being in a conversation with somebody, riding on a roller coaster, dancing, roller skating, whatever you're doing, your presence that you bring to it is really everything. But I do feel that it's in the experiencing that we actually embody something, that we actually are living something, and so we are kind of doing something. I believe we're always kind of doing something. Even when you're meditating or you're actively doing something with pleasure. I mean, why can't we make pleasure something you do if we're so kind of addicted to doing? Well, what if we do pleasure, right? So
right, but I think
flipping the tables.
I do think to start with, pleasure does have to be that, okay, I'm going to schedule pleasure between 6 and 8 p.m. on a Saturday. It does have to be something that you deliberately go and make happen. You do have to give yourself permission, but also like actively make it happen rather than waiting for it to descend upon you.
Mm-hmm. And what if pleasure was actually the way to build your self-worth and your self-confidence? How would that look?
Because it's about allowing yourself to have pleasure for the sake of pleasure. Saying, I'm a person who deserves great pleasure in my life rather than to suffer. Because if you come from a place of low self-worth, low confidence, then everything comes from a place of suffering or punishment or shame.
Yeah.
Whereas pleasure, I think, it does take real self-worth. Because I think if you, once pleasure becomes an addiction, it's actually no longer a pleasure. It's a coping mechanism or an escape.
Yeah, I love that.
And so there's a line that you cross. If pleasure's your coping mechanism, is it really pleasure? We could have a whole long debate about that, because it can be both, right? It doesn't have to be only one or the other. But pleasure that really is just pleasure, that has no purpose other than the sheer gorgeousness of the experience.
Yeah. And I like what Gaia says here. She says, I think pleasure is a byproduct of one's alignment with all of life. And I really like that, Gaia, because I do feel that when you have taken care of, you've taken ownership and leadership and responsibility for the different areas of your life, really, that's almost, to my way of experiencing things, I mean, that's really a validation that, you know, you have permission to experience pleasure and invest yourself
Yes.
in pleasure, and that I do feel that you will get more pleasure or better pleasure or quality pleasure in the knowing that you are taking care of what's important and your priorities in your life. And so, you know, when you're really doing that, you're humming along quite well. I mean, the permission should be a foregone conclusion, really. It's almost
Yeah.
like the, you
So
know,
it's the first
icing on the
permission.
cake, you know?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, because alignment is something that that I talk about a great deal, really, that it's one of the true secrets to self-worth is to know who you are and then to honor that. And perhaps in the honoring comes the pleasure of being yourself. Just the sheer joy of not living a lie in any way, of honoring what you desire. And that brings the element of pleasure into everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important as well to have pleasure be distinct from the absence of pain, because the absence of pain is not automatically pleasure. There's a neutrality first, isn't there? So alignment certainly brings the absence of pain, but there's a point at which this permission to just be authentically yourself, which is a very courageous place in a world that tells you you should be all these certain things in order to be acceptable, to allow yourself to just be yourself and get great pleasure from that.
That's nice. And is that a pleasurable process?
Not always. It could be, couldn't it? Wouldn't that be wonderful?
Oh, so that's it. What if you could have
I actually
permission to
think
make
that
that
ultimately, that's why people want it. That's why they're willing to do the work, is because they're hanging on to this like happy ending, right? They're holding on to this idea that it's going to be better, that at least it's not going to hurt on the other side, right? And but actually, I don't know, sometimes, I don't know about you, but sometimes when I've gone through the process of being more aligned or becoming more authentically myself or discovering another thing about myself or healing and coming back home to myself or forward home, whatever you want to call this stuff, sometimes it is enormously painful, some part of the journey. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes it can be incredibly gentle and loving and joyful. Just these little moments of like, oh, okay, and sometimes it can be quite humorous too, which is very pleasurable. But you don't have to take it quite so seriously.
Yeah, and I really believe that we can integrate pleasure in the process of of our growing and going through what we experience in life to integrate it more. So it's not just until we get there. I mean, how many people have I met who say, I'm going to work until I make this much money. I'm going to, get married and my kids. I'm going to, do this and do that. And until I have those in place, I'm not really going to allow myself pleasure along the way. And for me, this is withholding love from yourself. This is like denying yourself moments of break. And, we were talking last week on the Facebook Live with Celine Moran about pleasure and well-being. And, what if we could give ourselves more permission throughout our days to experience more pleasure and not necessarily feel that we have to have accomplished something to be able to actually experience pleasure, and we slip more into that state of joy. You don't have to earn
pleasure.
Say that again.
Pleasure doesn't have to be earned.
Yeah. Like, what if you didn't really have to earn it? You don't have to get permission for it. Like, the pleasure is here with us. It's integrative to the way that we experience life. And there are different measures of pleasure, surely, different kinds, different, it doesn't mean you don't have a reward for, the carrot for accomplishing
Yeah.
something where you
See, I
give
think
yourself
that's
permission.
really
But
important.
everyday
Like
pleasure.
pleasure, removing this idea of pleasure being your reward for whatever it is. Who says that? I mean, when you think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, why can't pleasure be on there? Or whatever someone's own. With my gang, I teach them a Jenga tower model of needs. Pleasure could absolutely be on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes when I'm cycling in the mountains on a bicycle, for example, and I'm kind of struggling and going at it, and I can feel my legs and I'm breathing heavy and it's maybe hot, I'm getting sweaty and I'm getting thirsty, and it's obviously an enjoyable experience, but I'm also kind of pushing myself. I'm kind of trying to get my breath going. I'm like creating a bit of a challenge. And, at the same time, I keep asking myself, how can I make this pleasurable? I mean, look around me where I am, surrounded by this beautiful green forest. I'm breathing clean air, fresh air. There's hardly any cars, there's no traffic, there's no pollution. I'm actually feeling my muscles in my legs working. And even though it's a little bit kind of, painful, it's nonetheless, I'm changing the way that I experience it so that actually I'm integrating the pleasure into the activity in a way more conscious, alert, alive way. I don't, anyone who's listening, have you ever experienced this where you, really try to focus on the gratitude, the sensory pleasures, the bonus that you're going to have from working out later when you go to the beach and you're in your bikini, right? To actually not make it such a task, but actually to make it in itself a pleasurable experience, or at least say framed and integrated. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. Yes. And a lot of that comes from reframing and the ability to mindfully notice what's going on for you and to decide how you want to give it meaning for yourself. Is it hard work and hot and sweaty and difficult? Or is it, something gorgeous and such a gift, and that isn't it wonderful that you've got a body that can enable you to do that and have that sweaty experience, and then the endorphins afterwards, and then if that's your thing, enjoy how you look later. And it is all about the focus. But then I think there's also, it's important not to bring toxic positivity or to sort of self-gaslight, right? So it could be both. It can be like hard work and sweaty and difficult and all these other more pleasurable things. And the two can coexist. It's important not to deny that it's also these less pleasant things in order to bring the pleasure in. And perhaps the pleasure is just in the experiencing the duality of it as well. I'm just on a live actually with David.
Okay. Hey Shay, welcome to the party, Shay.
Shay's here.
Thanks for joining us. So glad you're here, Gaia. Thanks for swinging by, Poppy. Does anyone have a question about giving yourself permission to have pleasure? And I wonder for you, Harriet, is there anything that you would like to have permission for related to pleasure?
Well, I was just thinking about actually how some things that are pleasurable are very easy to give yourself permission for, and other things are not so easy. And that I think we probably all have different things where, of course, you're allowed the pleasure of, a mouthful of chocolate or cheese or whatever it is. But for someone else, that could be a very difficult pleasure to allow themselves. Some people may find it easy to allow themselves the pleasure of wearing, wearing their best perfume or aftershave whenever they want, whereas for someone else it must be saved for best. Or the pleasure of taking a day off to lie in the sun, whatever it is. Like, we all have different things that feel easy or not easy. And so is there something I need to give myself permission to enjoy, to get pleasure from? I mean, the thing that's on my mind a lot, I actually have a kind of like live exam on Friday for this course that I've been on, which is extremely powerful, very amazing material. And I think that if I allowed myself to experience the vulnerability and the courage pleasurably, rather than this is really quite scary being assessed, and am I going to get it right, and like, if I can just experience the pleasure of, because it was a really big gift to myself to take this course. It's not something I needed for my business, or it was just a gift that I really wanted to learn from this person and really wanted to understand their work better. So that in that way, the learning has been a real duality of very triggery and distressing, but just incredible. And I've loved it. And I wonder whether I can bring that to this exam on Friday. And I'm the last one out of the group of 8 of us, so we're spending the whole of tomorrow and Friday watching each other, asking each other questions, and I wonder what real pleasure I can allow myself or open up to around that, rather than it feeling torturous. And some of the other experiences I'm having around it at the moment.
I love that's come into your awareness and consciousness. I can't wait to hear how you go about that. You've got permission.
Well, I was with a business friend actually, but we met up just for a dog walk and a really good catch up, because we haven't for ages, even though we really connected through business rather than personally. But we've always got on really well. And she laughed when I told her that I was a little concerned about this. She said it's a numpty check. And for those people watching who aren't British, a numpty is just like a complete and utter fool. She's like, basically, you're just being assessed to make sure you're not a complete and utter. It's a sanity check rather than like, do I really? It's not like I'm presenting a PhD here. Which helps me a lot, because I'm like, I'm not a numpty. I know I'm not a numpty. And maybe there's pleasure to be gained in the humility as well, because usually when I create material, and normally when I give a talk, I've created it, I have complete confidence in myself and in it, or whatever. Whereas this time, the humility of learning and teaching someone else's material 100%, but with my own spin on it, is that could be I do get pleasure from humility, which might make me sound very odd, but there's pleasure in being the beginner's pleasure.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. So I wanted to share something that Gaia put in here. It's a quote from somebody. It says, "It is within the experience of everyone that when pleasure and pain reach a certain intensity, they are indistinguishable." And that's Arnold Bennett. And that sounds like the integration that we were talking about, which is not a way of either being in denial or being toxically positive, but actually the kind of overlapping and integration. Potentially, it's just kind of another way of experiencing what you're going through, right? So I just think we have a tendency, because there's a bit of a negative bias, a cognitive bias, this doing bias, this sort of rational achievement that can pull us away from the pleasurable side of actually even achieving stuff. And when you think a lot of entrepreneurs who move quickly through their lives, and the minute they achieve something, they don't really stop and celebrate really in a way usually where there's really a pat on the back and like they give themselves the permission to actually celebrate that and appreciate that and share that celebration with those that have been a part of it, instead of sort of going home or finishing off the day and going a bit into a sort of a scarcity or only talking about the negative and not valuing or giving the meaning to actually that which was pleasurable that you've accomplished, right? To
Well,
feed
do you
that
know
and
this
like give that more
course I'm on
value,
at the moment?
give yourself permission.
Right. This course I'm on at the moment, in my welcome pack, I actually they sent each of us some confetti, and we've all said, you know, what our goals are, and when we hit our goal or anything that's meaningful and feels like a big achievement, even if it's a relatively small, it doesn't matter, then we have to make a video of ourselves covering ourselves in confetti and sharing our joy, which feels awesome. And you're right, there's not enough of that. I mean, I see quite a lot of boasting, which is different from appreciation, very much. There's a kind of a lot of the, you know, I'm this successful with this many clients, and, you know, this much turnover every month. And it's like, that's not, you know, that's different, isn't it? But just,
interesting.
And it does take courage to enjoy your accomplishments, rather than to boast about them or have them feed your ego, but to just bask in the pleasure of having achieved.
How do you go about that, Harriet? How do you get pleasure out of that, out of your achievements? So
It's
you
a
don't just go from one to the next, and you don't integrate it, you don't build your confidence.
I think it's about satisfaction, and it's about what I call stopping to admire the view. You know, like if you've climbed a mountain, you should stop and admire the view and soak it all up, really experience it, rather than go, okay, where's the next mountain, and just not even look at the view. You have to really stop and experience and live with the view for a bit. Yeah, that's what I think. And sometimes I tell clients when they've had a big thing that feels big to them, even if it's just that they set a boundary, right? Or they blocked someone on social media, whatever it is, tell them to do something to mark it. And it doesn't need to be a big thing. It can be just that they get themselves a little small crystal, or I had one client who used to buy theatre tickets, or something that's just a gift to themselves that marks, I did this thing, a thing that is meaningful for them.
Nice. I like this.
Yeah, and I do that actually every year for my sobriety anniversary. I always get myself a gift.
Fantastic.
Yeah, sometimes it's a big gift, sometimes it's a very small gift. It doesn't matter. It's just something meaningful.
Yeah, it doesn't. No, and I find that to be a beautiful ritualistic ceremonial way to regularly bring, it's giving yourself permission to have the pleasure of celebrating, the pleasure of feeling proud in a healthy way, the pleasure of acknowledgement, and the pleasure of having put in the work, the pleasure of you know, having the impact that you want to have,
of showing up for yourself,
the pleasure of self-commitment, of showing up, of having done like your upcoming, you know, test here, like the pleasure of having already come that far. It's like you've already won, really, right? No, that's really beautiful. I think there's a lot of power in it. And I think as we start to give ourselves permission to celebrate and feel the pleasure, you know, even like I get like smiley about it when I think of actually how much we all can benefit from, celebrating these small wins and victories and the bigger ones also, in a way that's pleasurable and communicates to people that, you know, it's not just about crushing it or killing it or, you know, burning out or boring out to finally get to the pleasure, right? That along the way, there's lots of steps, and it doesn't take away from performance. I think it's completely the opposite, which is a whole nother Facebook Live pleasure or performance, but it really
there's a
it's for me
whole
it's the enhancement,
there's a
you know.
yeah, there's a whole school of thought, isn't there, that if you have your pleasure along the way, then you'll lose focus and you won't be able to perform. You know, there's a lot of sports people who are not allowed to experience sexual pleasure before a big match or a big fight or whatever it is, because it's supposed to build that
Yeah.
tension. I don't know. I'm not sure I agree with that. But what do
Yeah, and
you?
at the end of the day, it's really what is working for you. I mean, some people are not having maybe the success, the fulfillment, the results that they would desire, and maybe it's because they're not integrating pleasure. They're not giving themselves permission for pleasure along the way. They're not stopping on the mountain, like you said, at the different stages to actually really take a great gulp of delicious
Yeah,
water and look around at the trees and the sky and like photograph it with all of your senses, smell the
exactly.
beautiful flowers of pine trees
And you
and
also get
actually
to
along the
see how
way.
far you've come. You really get to see how far you've
Yeah,
come. I mean, I do
yeah,
a big hike up to the highest point in the area every Sunday morning with some girlfriends, and we do stop on the way up and just look down and take pictures and notice the way the view changes as you and see how far we've come. And sometimes we try not to stop because we want to get the pleasure of the accomplishment of going all the way up without stopping, and that's great too.
yeah.
But that's a conscious, deliberate decision that that's part of the pleasure.
Mm. So what three things, let's put a number on it, what three ways, what three perspectives would you like to share with everyone that's here and will be watching this about how
Yeah,
to give yourself permission for pleasure in your life?
I think the first thing is to get rid of the idea that you need permission for pleasure. Don't need
Mm,
permission for pleasure. You can just have pleasure. And as a human, you have capacity for pleasure the whole time. It doesn't need to be something that you can only have between a few very small hours. You don't need to, I mean, you can schedule your pleasure, but what would happen if you experienced pleasure all the time in small ways rather than it needing to be a big chunk of pleasure?
mm,
And what would be the last thing that to experience the duality of pleasure and struggle, or pleasure and pain, or pleasure and discomfort at the same time, and to know that you can experience pleasure, because to try to find moments when it's so pure may be almost impossible. This perfection doesn't exist, and so to experience imperfect pleasure, some duality there, wonderful. Allow that.
mm, thank you. Very nice.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe we'll wrap this up now,
Okay. I wish
if
we could
that's
just
okay.
wrap each other up in a hug. Hopefully soon,
Yeah,
John.
yeah. We'll give ourselves permission for that pleasure soon.
Yeah, definitely.
And is there any parting words you want to share? Of course, also where can people look you up and find you, Harriet
Well,
Waley-Cohen?
probably here on Facebook,
Yeah.
they can look me up in come over to my free group, Harriet's Inner Circle. That is probably the best place. But I'm all over all sorts of other platforms, and I have a very unique name. So you just look me up, you'll find me.
Okay, beautiful. And would you like to share any last words to give us permission for pleasure?
Everyone deserves pleasure. And pleasure is not something you have to go out and get. You can experience pleasure in any moment purely by choosing to.
Mm, mm. Yeah, let that sink in. That's beautiful. Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. This has been pleasurable. I'm very glad that we gave each other permission to
for this
to have this
conversation. Yeah,
together.
me too. It's just
And
such a joy to talk with you and to
yeah,
share together.
thank you for this. And I look forward to continuing this conversation because there's a lot to unpack here, I
Definitely.
feel. So
Definitely.
we'll keep the discussion going. And thank you everyone who's come by to see us and spend some time with us today, to give us your attention. We're sending love from France and UK.
Showering you in love. Bye.
All right. Lots of love. Bye.
Bye.